to come together and see the history of the church, help us to see the good and bad here, and to be edified from it and warned by it. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, before we dive into popes, I'll ask sort of some questions about pastors today, and kind of think about how does this happen? Because the papacy doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not like the Catholic Church just said, okay, here's what the Pope is, and they're in charge of all the church. It's slowly developed over time, and we want to think about how that process occurred, how that developed, how it came to be, and why the church ended up where it was, and then where it is, the Catholic Church, why it ended up where it was and where it is today. Part of the confusion through that is going to be talking about sort of little c Catholic Church and big C Catholic Church, which we've talked about through this class, where this idea that the church is universal, that's all that Catholic means is universal, but then at some point we sort of switch over into the Roman Catholic Church, as it were. So much like the class on monasticism, we'll sort of start off with some good things about it and progress into some bad, and go from there. So let's take a step back. So pastors, who are, just throw out some names. Who are the most important living pastors? Throw out some names. MacArthur. Who else? We got MacArthur. What was that?
John Piper.
Piper.
They have to be good.
They don't have to be good. Just throw out some names.
No Christians. Not Benny Hinn or anything like that.
What was that? Vodi Bakum. Joel Osteen. We got it. Somebody said it. Okay. Who's Benny Hinn? Who's Rick Warren? Okay, Tim Keller. All right. So we got these different names. All right. So now we've got all these different names. We've got everybody from Benny Hinn to John MacArthur and so on and so forth. We could keep going. We could go just think about all sorts of different famous pastors, celebrity pastors, and people sort of decry the celebrity pastor crisis where everybody is following all these big names. That has been the case throughout church history. There's always been big names, important pastors and things like that. This is not a new phenomenon, very well known. And there's some parallels we could sort of draw between now and then. Let me ask you, what living pastor, so we're talking about living pastors, what living pastor is most influential to your life aside from your pastors here at HBF? So aside from people here that you sit under week to week, who are the most influential pastors alive today that affect your life? I don't just mean influential, but influential in your specific life. So John MacArthur, okay.
The first church I went to was his.
Okay.
He baptized me.
Okay, so first church you went to was his. He baptized you. Charles Stanley, okay. Alistair Begg. So what makes these different pastors, and we keep going on, what makes these different pastors influential in your life today here at HBF? What makes those pastors influential?
They're following Scripture.
What was that?
They're following Scripture.
But how does that, but there's also some guy in some church in New York, upstate New York State, who's following Scripture, who's not influential in your life at all. What makes them different? Access, okay, so you have access to them, so you can watch their sermons, listen to their sermons, put them on the radio or podcast as you drive back and forth. What else? What else do they do?
They are courageous enough to take stands that are controversial.
Okay.
So they end up in the news and they end up affecting public life.
Okay, so they end up in the news, they end up affecting public life. So let's, I'll throw one out there from MacArthur. So I'm most familiar with MacArthur. I've been down there, been to the Grace Community Church, been to the school and so on. So I'll throw out, he's the one I'm going to lean on most for this next 10 minutes. Their church fought a court case back in the 90s, I believe it was the 90s, on biblical counseling. So they were counseling a person. The person later committed suicide. The family blamed the church for not sending them to a certified psychiatrist. And so there was a legal suit brought against the church for malfeasance in dealing with counseling. They fought the court case and won the court case and has sort of set up a precedent, because law goes by precedence, sets up a precedent that protects all of churches and all of America for handling counseling in a biblical basis. So that church sets up legal precedents by their prominence and popularity and ability to have millions of dollars worth of lawyers' fees either donated to the church because people know them or given for the church and so on and so forth. So they bear a legal burden for the rest of the churches. So that's one thing that John MacArthur does. What are some other ways that these other pastors impact your life?
Practical application of correct biblical exposition.
Okay, so how does that impact you? How does MacArthur, Alistair Begg, or somebody like that affect you, where the guy in upstate New York doesn't?
They're usually most familiar with Alistair Begg. 2 o'clock in the morning. Well,
It happens.
I listen, okay? But as he's going through, he makes the application to himself, and then he says, now it might be affecting you, and the way it affects people in the Bible. And
Yeah, so-
really puts an arrow straight through the heart, you know?
Right. So there's a level of some of these people become famous and renowned because of their ability to preach well, because of their ability to affect the heart and things like this. So publishing sermons, I mean, you can go, I've got on my bookshelf at home, Sermons of Martin Luther for the same reason, right? Because they're impactful and they get to you. So there's a level of skill and ability that they bring to the table and ability of rhetoric, of speaking. That rhetoric gets put into books in different ways. So they write books and other things.
They go verse by verse and not topical.
Okay.
Don't just pull things out
So
of the hat.
the people that you're and that then leads to trends, and they set the stage, right? Because if you go back 100 years ago, the bulk of preaching in America, in the evangelical church, is not verse by verse. It is topical. It is, let me take a subject that's relevant to my church, that's relevant to the people, let me find verses and let me preach a message to you. Whereas today, virtually all evangelical preaching is verse by verse. Why is that? It's because people like Martin Lloyd-Jones and John MacArthur and others that have popularized this idea and then taught it to pastors and sent them out, and we now have seminaries like Master Seminary with John MacArthur and training centers like with John Piper and Ligon Duncan and all these different places where they raise up the next generation of preachers and send them out. So you're affected by John MacArthur in that 2 of the 4 elders here graduated from his school and sent them out. So that's a way. So raising up seminaries, education, even raising up K through 12 schools and colleges. MacArthur is the president, or was the president, of the Masters University in California, as well as the Masters Seminary. They also, they don't have it now, but at one point in time they had a K through 9 school that I attended, my sisters attended. So there's all sorts of ways where they're doing these things. Other things, they're writing curriculum. Our youth curriculum, our children's curriculum comes from MacArthur. Some of our other children's curriculum for the service comes from Piper's Church, and they put these things out. We see different conferences going on. We have the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. We have, MacArthur did the Strange Fire Conference a few years back, talking about the Pentecostal movement. We get parachurch organizations, missions agencies, all of these different things that are sort of established and built up very often under personalities. Right, underneath specific people, right? That these things get built up and sent out. So we see that today in our evangelical world, which is very much anti-clerical, anti-church establishment. Yet we still see those things happening today. So now let's take ourselves back 1,800 years. Let's think back to 300 AD or so. The church now is not only much more unified than it is today, it's also much more, persecuted, but it's much more, so unified and authoritarian, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but there's a greater deference to the bishops, to the pastors and things like that. So there is more, so this same thing happens. Schools raise up, sermons are published, curriculum is put out, and so that there's this influence of particular churches. Now, yeah.
It wasn't part of that because of they didn't have the reading and writing abilities most population.
That's part of it, right? Where are the most renowned preachers today? Where, location-wise, where are they? Where's MacArthur? L.A. right? He's in L.A. Where's Piper? Yeah, Twin Cities. Yeah, Minneapolis. Where's Alistair Begg? Cincinnati, right? Cincinnati. Where's Ligon Duncan? Jacksonville. Big cities, right? Big cities have prestige today, right? Whether we realize it or not, whether we think about it or not, big cities do. Talent is accumulated in big cities and things like that. And that was the case back then. Where are all the best preachers? They're in places like Rome and Alexandria and later Constantinople and Caesar. So we get big names associated with big cities. So this is the start of this sort of growing up. We see the analogy that's being made here? Okay, so what we're going to kind of do is trace now the specifics of how this happens, how sort of well-established preachers then get moved into the papacy. So let's, end of analogy, let's talk about the papacy. What do you think when I say Pope, papacy? What are your thoughts? What do you think about the papacy?
Reagan.
Sorry? Bad, okay, bad. Did you say Reagan?
Pagan.
Pagan. Oh, it was you. Okay. I was like, I do not see the connection here, but okay, pagan, bad.
Well, there's a lot of history and there's a lot of negative things that happened through the centuries.
Okay, a lot of history to it.
A lot of accumulation of power.
A lot of accumulation of power. Other things.
I was brought up in the Catholic Church. My dad was a Jesuit seminarian for 9 years before I decided to get married. I forget my point.
It's all right. It happens to me too. The papacy. So we've got a lot of history and a lot to deal with through this time. The papacy is probably Pete.
Yeah, just when I was taught, Catholic schools and all that, the papacy can be traced back to Peter. They're like sort of
A succession.
from the Apostle Peter.
Laying on of hands from the first come all the way to Peter.
Yeah. There's a succession. We'll talk about that. Yeah.
There's a lot of change that's occurred with the papacy from the beginning of when they truly started,
Yeah.
until today. They're not the same church they were.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of ups and downs, a lot of good and bad in this. We can say, I think it's fairly safe to say that the papacy is the longest lasting institution, at least in the West, if not in the world. Period. It has been in effect. Really, pastors in Rome, if you allow that idea, has been in effect for 2,000 years. There really is not an uninterrupted, but we can think of it as a legitimate succession of popes from today to Peter, more or less. Okay, give or take. We can say that it's a long-lasting institution, and you go through something for 2,000 years. There's a lot of change in that, and it goes from good and bad and things like that. Pope Gregory the Great, that we'll talk about from the 600s or so. John Calvin calls him the last good pope. Other people would say there's other good popes and things like that, but we get this succession of good and bad and wicked and righteous and all through it. So any guesses on how many popes there have been? 260 or 2,000 years, how many popes have there been? Anybody know?
Not as many as the Roman Church thinks there are.
Okay. How many are on the list? How many are on the official Roman list? Any guesses? 2,000 years is a long time.
Well, there are about 300,
70?
300 years of history that didn't have any pope. Yeah, so.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit. Anything else? All right, no guesses. We got 70. That's my only guess. I can only get one guess out of a class from all people. 300? Yeah, that's closer than 70. So 266. There's been 266 popes. One of the things is it's a lot of turnover. You're pope until you die, but most popes are elected very late in life. So 266 popes. There's only been 2 that have had a reign of 30 years or more. So there's only 2 that have been pope for longer than 30 years.
Well, some more than one pope would eat in the same time.
Oh, yeah. There's only been 14 popes that have been pope for 20 years. So most popes have been for 10 years or less. There were 69 that were 10 to 20 years. 42 between 5 and 10. 97 were only pope between 1 and 5 years. And there were 42 that were popes less than a year. So 42 popes that were pope less than a year. And pretty much all of them die. There's a few that step down or advocate and whatnot. What was that?
He said he just died, however.
Right. The other thing is corruption. We think of the papacy, we think of corruption. That is not a peculiarly Protestant view. Okay, that's something that we sort of as Protestants have a view that the Catholic Church views the popes as holy, they're all saints, and they're all infallible and they can't be wrong and whatnot. That's not the Catholic view of the popes, actually. The Catholics who have any sense of history, who are educated in the church at all, have a sense of the popes as saints and sinners. There's a course that I listened to in preparation for this class by a friar, Friar John W. O'Malley, well-known historian. He's taught at Harvard and things like that in the recent years. He does a course on the popes. And he talks about all sorts of schism and issues. And there's one pope that's killed because he's thrown out of a window by a husband because he's caught with his wife. And so he's killed by being thrown out of the window. So there's all sorts of stories like that of the corruption. There's, yeah. So, and I mean, there's popes that have been anathematized. There's one pope during the Diocletian persecution that we talked about who offered incense to the gods and handed over books. So Pope Marcellus, and so he has been condemned. Pope Honorius I, during one of these descriptions, one of these councils, was deposed and anathematized by the Eastern Church for having a wrong view of Christ's deity. And then the later popes affirmed that and said, yes, he's anathematized. He's a heretic. So that's a legend. So we should talk about that. So Pope Joan from the 9th century, 10th century, 900s, is called the Dark Ages of the Popish Church. So there is a legend that just becomes well established in the Middle Ages that there was actually a female pope, and she was discovered while giving birth on a horse. And it's apocryphal. It didn't happen. It's not true. There hasn't been a Pope Joan. She took the name Joan. So there's a story that's well known and put out there, but it's not actually a true story. So it's a great story, but it's not a true story. But it is representative, though, of the papacy. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, this story about a female pope, it's not like everybody hears it, it's like, no, that couldn't be the case. Everyone's like, yep, that's true. That happened. Right? It's one of these stories that's like, it's false, but it's true. If you get what I mean. Like, the details are false. It didn't really happen. But the sense of it, the sense that the papacy was so corrupt that this could happen is real, and it was what people thought about with it. So there are popes that were children of previous popes, which shouldn't be a thing, right? It's been in the Middle Ages. The priesthood is supposed to be celibate, and you get your illegitimate son put on the throne or your grandson put on the throne. So these kinds of things, these things happen. So the papacy is well known for these issues. But let's take a step back and let's talk about the evolution of it. How does this happen? So on one hand, so let's take ourselves back to the first. Well, let's think. What's sort of the theological background? What happens? What is Rome's claim to fame? Aside from being the capital of the Roman Empire and the center of that, we've talked about how the bishops, the pastors, their sort of church government model follows the imperial model, and so the church at Rome gets a special prominence because Rome is Rome. But what else? What theological reasons do the popes have for being first among equals or preeminent?
Well, they make the false claim that Peter was the first pope and they have succession, except they don't have succession, especially when they have the Babylonian captivity of the papacy.
Okay, so we have Peter in Rome. Peter dies in Rome, Paul dies in Rome. That's probably true. It's probably true that Peter goes to Rome and dies there and is crucified upside down. We don't have firsthand accounts of that. It shows up 50 years or so after the fact. But it's one of those things where if some other city knew he was killed in their city, they would have claimed him. It seems like this is just universally accepted by the early church. Yes, Peter made it to Rome. Peter died in Rome. Paul died at the same time, give or take a year. These two men die in Rome together. So they've got the special privilege of being established by Peter and by Paul. Not established in the sense of founded, because we know there were Christians there before Paul, there were Christians there before Peter, but they come and sort of rule over the church there. That's how the story goes.
Except they never did. Peter never did.
Peter never what?
He never ruled over anything in Rome.
I guess it defines what we mean by rule. If we think of him as sitting in garb, sitting there, no. But if we think of him as doing his apostolic work and being there as an apostle, I think it's clear from the New Testament that the apostles had an authority, and him going there would have had an authority that's established.
Well, it's also the final empire, as you say, from Daniel. You know, the four great empires.
Okay.
That's the last one. So from a biblical standpoint, that's the last empire before the end times.
Okay, I'm not sure. That doesn't pull into their justification of it, per se.
Well, it was part of it was a huge empire, though.
It's a huge empire. They're going to rest on Matthew 16. Peter, who do you say that I am? Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of God. Blessed are you, Peter. Flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you. Lord God revealed it to you. Upon this rock I will build my confession, or I'll build my church. We're not going to talk about those verses and the definition of them, but the church, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church in particular, takes the rock as Peter, because there's a pun on his name going on there. The traditional, the standard, what I would hold to, Protestant view is that the rock that Jesus is punning with there is his confession. So, blessed are you, Peter, you saw this, your confession is true. On that confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God, based on that is what my church will be built on. But the church takes this as, Peter, you're the rock I'm going to build the church on. And Peter is preeminent among the disciples.
Did the still living apostles and people like Timothy and Luke, did they think that that's what that meant?
I would say we don't have commentary. We don't have enough information to know. It gets interpreted that way pretty early. I would say by 300, it's a well-established understanding. I don't know enough to answer prior to that. So I don't know that I can answer. But by 300, the church is fully standing on that interpretation, as at least the church in Rome for sure is standing on that interpretation of that. The other thing that we see is Peter is the preeminent disciple. We see that, we see that in the Bible. How do we see that in the Bible? Why is Peter the preeminent of the 12 apostles? He's always out front, so we see him more often than the others. He's always getting into trouble. But there's other reasons too. In all of the lists, he's in the inner circle. So we see Peter, John, and now I'm blanking, James, thank you. So we see these three together. So they're inner circle. And then with Peter in particular, whenever the disciples are listed, Peter's first. The order of the others changes, but Peter's always first. When we see the Acts of the Apostles, it's Peter and then Paul. Everyone else is sort of, is background character. They're there and they're important, but it's Peter, what happens with Peter, and it's what happens with Paul, and it's the spread of the gospel. So we see this reason for the preeminence of Peter and Paul. And now as the Catholic Church, Rome, they've got Peter and Paul, they're there. There's actually pretty good evidence that the Basilica, St. Peter's Basilica, which is this in Rome, is built over a likely tomb of Peter. Caveats, asterisks, etc. on that. But there's pretty good evidence that it's at least built on something very, very old, very, very early. That was a tomb and said to be Peter. So this is what's going on. So early stages. Before we get to Sylvester, pre-Constantine. Yeah, go ahead.
Everything you brought up about Catholic Church, why wouldn't the decision
It's a great question.
was the big center,
Mhm.
because, you know, you got the supposed
Yeah,
sepulcher of Christ, and
that's
I'm,
yeah. No, it's great.
and
That-
none of the apostles were over
That-
the church. It was James.
That's a great question. There's two answers to that. Because that's a perfect question. Number one is I'm going to give the cynical political answer, which partly plays into this, is Jerusalem's destroyed in 70, and it's a backwater now. So there's just the straight up, you know, cities are where it's at. It's going to be Jerusalem, it's going to be Antioch, it's going to be Alexandria, it's going to be Constantinople eventually. So Jerusalem is now backwater. They're destroyed. So that's part of it. And then the theological answer is the book of Acts. We move from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth, and the ends of the earth is signified by Rome. So the book moves from Jerusalem to Rome. We start in Jerusalem, we end in Rome. And so that's sort of the theological basis for it. It's a theological answer. It's why is this? Because it's moved away from the Jews and the Judaizers to the world. And where do we see that? We see it centered in Rome. And then throw the political and things like that on top of it. All these things become cumulative cases for Rome. Other questions?
I was going to say, Paul considers himself the apostle to the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you see Acts saying that it is going out, but you also see everywhere else in the New Testament talking about Gentiles being added
Mm-hmm.
to the mix. So there's a certain level of God spreading the word
Mm-hmm.
to the world. The Jews failed to live that
Right.
what they were supposed to do.
And Rome becomes the center of that. And the book of Romans is the longest letter by Paul, and so on and so forth. So you get all these sort of cumulative case type arguments that are made. But really, a big part of it is just the politics of it. Jerusalem's destroyed. Rome is your obvious next candidate, and is where good preachers are going to be. The church is going to be no stranger to anti-popes. So an anti-pope is a person who says, I'm the pope, and the other person says, no, I'm the pope. And we get this very early on. So in 260, we have Hippolytus, who claims to be pope in Rome, and he leads sort of a seditious factor. The interesting thing is Hippolytus is also canonized. He's a saint. So he's an anti-pope, and he's a saint in the Catholic Church. So that should let you see sort of some of the it's not as straightforward as we think about sometimes with this. Where here's this person who can lead a schismatic church in Rome, who is also then canonized by the Catholic Church. And again, there's going to be popes that are anathematized and things like that. So it's not a straightforward. Popes are infallible and leaders of the church, and it's an office that sort of has a complex understanding to it.
Maybe this to ask this question. What's the necessity for having, I don't want to say this, top dog?
Yeah.
What makes the churches think they have to unify under some big umbrella?
Yep. That's a great question. That is the assumption. Like the question of different churches just doesn't make sense. So Augustine, I meant to have a whole class on Augustine, and we're just not going to. But Augustine talks about the church, and the idea that there can be a church that's not united with the church. Think John 16 and his high priestly prayer. Right? Let them be one, be unified, and so on. The church is the bride of Christ. You can't have two brides. You can't have a bride here and then the Presbyterian bride down the church. It doesn't make sense. There's one bride. There's one church. And so there's unity. And the unity starts off very informally. We see this even the idea of Paul traveling around and visiting different places and establishing churches and appointing elders, and it follows on from that. So we have Paul establishing elders. Now we've got other bishops establishing elders around. It just sort of flows. It flows from it very naturally. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm just saying historically it very naturally flows from it.
It's like saying, ultimately, any and every church has ever had any associations, John MacArthur is going to end up appointing him pope.
Mm-hmm. So,
You're saying it's kind of a natural possession?
so I guess natural progression, but don't think of it as natural progression in your lifetime of you thinking, think of it as over 4, 5, 8 generations, 10 generations. The churches don't get there overnight. They don't get there in 1 or 2 generations. They get there over 3, 4, 5, 600 years. John Calvin calls Gregory the Great the last good pope, but he does a lot to consolidate power and things like that. But he's the 800s, and you can sort of think of him as really establishing the papacy and power and stuff like that. So one of the things, I think I'm going to answer that question to some degree as we go on. Yeah.
I think one of the things that you'll see argued in churches throughout the world even today is the concept of the universal versus the local church. And where in Scripture is it a universal church? Is it a local church? And you'll actually hear different people teach differently about. Some people will teach that both exist at the same time. Some will teach that, like the Catholic, there's only one universal church, there can only be one. And then there's the Protestant side, which kind of leans more towards the local, but there's some that go back and forth. But there is a whole set of books written about this, about the universal church versus the local church. And where in Scripture it means those two things.
Right. Yeah. So the difference between the universal and local. I mean, that's a very the concept that there's a difference between those two things, and we can talk about them differently, really is a theology that's developed in the Reformation and doesn't really exist before that. So I'm going to skip over the first 300 years or so. We're going to go to 314, Pope Sylvester. So he is the bishop in Rome. He is the bishop during the time Constantine comes to power. So he's the first pope with a lack of persecution, with favor, and with money. Right? So he's the first pope with money. So what do you do with that money? Well, a couple things you do is you build other churches. You build churches because you've got a lot of people now coming into the church. So he's the first pope to really start building programs.
So we're talking about the big cathedral types of the churches then?
We're getting there. We're getting there. Don't think Renaissance. Don't think the first slide, St. Peter's Basilica. But yes, we are getting big churches and things like that that are coming into play. We get setting up a fund. So what does a pastor? What does a pope do? So on one hand, he's the pastor of Rome. He preaches and counsels and helps people, but he's also he's an administrator, right? He is a vast administrator, and now you have lots of giving of gifts. Gift giving, we think of today as something that's very fungible, right? So any accountants in the room, Kinsey, what does fungible mean? Our gifts today are fungible. What does that mean? They're movable. I can easily give you $1,000, right? I can write a check. I can pull out my phone. I can Venmo you, right? I can do whatever. I can send you 1,000. Our assets today, for the most part, are very fungible. Assets back then are almost completely infungible. It's land, or it's goods, or it's services. It's things of that nature. So if you're going to give a lot of, we even see this in Acts, right? What are people doing? They're selling land. It takes an effort to sell land, get the money from it, give it to the church, or giving land to the church, and so on and so forth. So the church slowly starts to become a land-owning entity. It owns a lot of land. It owns more and more land because wealthy people are donating it. And they're not only donating land, but they're donating farms with the workers on the farms. So I could give, if it's the teach a man to fish type of thing. I can give the church a fish, or I could give the church a fisherman who gives you one fish every year or whatever, right? So people are giving estates to the church. So now what does the church have to do? The church has to manage these estates. And by this point in time, the church basically has over 3,000 people on the rolls, 3,000 widows on the rolls, basically, by this point in time, that they're dealing with in Rome. Rome is a city of about 1 million people at this point in time, and they've got over 3,000 widows that they're managing giving to. And the Pope is appointing people and helping people and setting this up. Well, what's going to happen, even with the best of intentions, what's going to happen over time? More and more time is concerned with managing your assets and controlling these things and giving out money and doing all these sorts of things. And as the church starts, or not as the church, as the empire starts to fade in the West, which is going to rapidly do over the next couple hundred years, as the empire fades, what fades with the empire? So the land sits there, but the ability to monitor the land. So as the empire fades, I mean the empire, it's the Pax Romana. What's the Pax Romana? Peace of Rome. You can travel. You don't have to worry about being robbed so much. Yes, you got to pay your taxes, but Rome keeps everybody in line. As there's no more Rome, it's like all the police are gone. The army is gone. You've got to manage this yourself. And so aristocrats are managing their land and hiring their own personal guard and things like this to protect their assets and so on and so forth. Well, now the Pope has control of estates and guards and things like this where it sort of naturally comes about. And how do you, so you're Pope, okay, I just made you Pope in 400. The empire's falling down. Rome is sacked in 410, which the city had not been sacked in over 800 years. So the city is sacked with all the brutalism that entails. What do you do in the ashes from that? You've got these estates, you've got people that are loyal to you, you've got guards to protect that stuff. What do? Yeah, you take charge. You do what you have to do. You see all these people in Rome that are now destitute and destroyed and sickness and all the things that comes with a siege, from death and illness because there's bodies everywhere, to all sorts of pregnancies because of rapes and things like that. What do you do with this? And the poverty and all the wealth is now gone. You're the person in charge. You've got an education, whereas most people don't. You have access to funds. You have access to army. You establish order. You help people. You set up welfare systems for them. You set up protection with armies and so on and so forth. So you're doing all these things. So that happens for great reasons and is helpful. Now what happens over time? What has the papacy now become? A financial center. It's become a government. It's become a government. And what does the government have to have? A government has to have, what does the government have to run?
Army.
Taxes, army, laws, bureaucracy. And this becomes true of all of the papal estates. And now you've got a country who's doing all these things that is religiously centered and religiously founded, so who has theological reasons for existing as well as practical reasons for existing, and in the best of times is very concerned about the poor and is giving away more money than any other entity, period. I mean, they're giving all sorts of care and aid and things like that. What happens to this government that is not hereditary and doesn't have a succession line? What happens there? Yeah, you're going to have, the politics is going to be unreal, right? And it is, it becomes unreal. The politics with the Pope is just so complicated. It's so complicated. There's so much intrigue in this. I mean, whatever dynastic politics you can think of, whether it's the French from the 17th century or the 9th century Korean, or whatever dynastic politics you think is complicated, the papacy is more complicated. It just becomes incredibly politically complex. And so we see some of this just inner workings and nepotism and things like this coming into play. And then people coming to power for all the wrong reasons, right? Because it's a government. It's a government that you can get yourself into, that you can get your child into, that you can buy into. So that's sort of the progression of it. We'll talk more about this progression, but what I want to do is just go through sort of a series of popes and continue to talk about this progression. So I forgot to, so this picture, this is a late medieval picture. So this is of Pope Sylvester and Constantine. Which one's Constantine? No. Constantine is not on the throne. That's what's so striking about this picture, is here's Constantine, lower, bending down, and he's giving a gift. Anybody know what this gift is? It's what? It looks like a sailboat, okay? It's called the donation of Constantine. Okay, the donation of Constantine. So in this, in the Middle Ages, which, what do we know? 700, 800 or so. So this happens, this meeting never happens. I don't believe Pope Sylvester ever met Constantine, actually. But in this fake meeting here, Constantine is coming before Pope Sylvester, and he's giving the donation of Constantine, which is all of the Western Roman Empire. So he's giving him all the Western Roman Empire. And this forgery comes out called the donation of Constantine, where Constantine deeds over the western half of the empire to the Pope to manage. This is a forgery that not really sure where it comes from. It may have been written by one of the popes. That seems less likely. It actually seems more like it was someone trying to get in with the popes who sort of presented it, and then, anyway, the history of where it comes from is lost. What? No, the donation, the document. So there's a document called the Donation of Constantine where it's deeded over to popes. But this becomes used in the Middle Ages for some of this increased power over time. So this is not an accurate rendition of Pope Sylvester at this time. He would not have acted like this towards Constantine. But this is a vision of medieval popes on what the papacy is like. The emperor bows before the pope. So let's move forward. Pope Siricius, 384 to 399. So now we're fast forwarding 100 years from our last pope there. He is maybe the first pope to actually call himself a pope. Maybe. Might not be true. He is the first pope to call for priestly celibacy. So he is the first pope to say all priests should be celibate, they should not have wives. Part of the reason for that is just a high view of virginity, which we've talked about in previous classes. But the other part of this is just the growing wealth of the church. What's the problem with having married priests?
They got to take care of their family.
Both of those. So they have to take care of their family, so that becomes a thing. And they have to take care of their family, meaning who's going to get, I'll be bishop, and I'll stay here till I'm old, and then my son will take over, and then his son will take over, and so on and so forth. In the Frankish kingdoms, you actually get, you don't get right of the firstborn, you get division of the kingdom. So Charlemagne's empire, which we'll talk about in a little bit, gets divided into 3 regions for his 3 sons, which, if you're the Catholic Church, that's no good. You don't want the church split into 3 or 5 or 2 or whatever, and you don't really want it handed from father to son because of corruption and things like that, right? So he's the first one. This is the first letters of a pope that we have, where he sort of answers questions. Decretals, you may have heard of those. The first decretals that exist are from Pope Siricius. They don't quite have the modern idea of decretals, but the very first letters from a pope that we have are from him. So we're at 400, a little bit earlier, but 400. Let's go forward to the next pope or so. Pope Innocent, so the first, so 401 to 417. He is pope when Rome is sacked by the Visigoths. So 410, Rome is sacked. He's the pope during that time and after. And from all accounts, he does sort of a heroic job of aiding the city that's just been destroyed, that's been decimated. It's are they pagan or are they Aryan? Does anybody remember? Do you remember? They're Aryan. I think they're an Aryan Germanic tribe, so they are not favorable to Orthodox Christianity. So major trauma, Pope Innocent is there, and this goes a long way practically towards to raising the power of the Pope, even though that's not his aim. Right? His aim is there is catastrophe, there is no government, everyone is looking to the church. What do? He's got resources and he uses them for the good of the people there. Pope Leo the Great. There are only 2 popes called the Great. Leo is one of them. All right, who knows the name Attila the Hun? Okay, does anybody not know the name Attila the Hun? Nobody. Everybody knows the name Attila the Hun. Okay.
That was my neighbor's wife, wasn't it?
All right. That's okay. That's shocking that everybody knows the name Attila the Hun. Why? Somebody tell me, why is that shocking that everybody knows the name of Attila the Hun?
Because he was such a bad dude.
Okay, he was such a bad dude.
He took over much of the world at the time.
Took over a bunch of the world at the time.
Not the Western
But,
descendants, because everywhere he went, he took on a wife or
okay. So you might be thinking, so Attila the Hun, we don't know how many descendants he has. Who's the Mongol? Genghis Khan is the descendants you're thinking of. But you know the name Genghis Khan, you know the name Attila the Hun. Who's the 5th president? Much more recent, much more impactful in your own history. You have no idea. Nobody knows in this room. Is there anybody in this room who knows the name of the 5th president?
ask the 3 to 5-year-olds.
Is it Madison? I don't know. I didn't even look. So none of you know the name of the 5th president, and everybody knows the name of Attila the Hun, right? And he lived. When is this? This is 400 AD, 450. He's around. So you know somebody's name from 1,500 years ago, and you know his name as bad guy, someone to be feared, someone evil, which should tell you there's been 1,500. Like his reign of terror, he's called the Scourge of God, was so horrible that for 1,500 years people have remembered him as an evil person. I mean, maybe Hitler gets that. Maybe 1,500 years ago people know the name Hitler, probably. But that's Attila the Hun. He is known to you, to everyone in this room, 1,500 years later. It's great. And then why? Because he's known in the East. He attacks the Roman Empire in the East. He attacks the Roman Empire in the West. He makes it basically all the way to Paris. He makes it into Italy. He's going to storm Rome. He's going to defeat. He's going to come in and lay siege to Rome. Leo goes out to meet him. So Leo personally goes out. There's no other person with the authority. He's the one. Who are you going to send to represent Rome? You're going to send Leo. You're going to send the pastor of the city. So the pastor of the city, he goes out to meet with Attila the Hun. This is a later rendition of the Pope meeting Attila. You see Peter and Paul there with him. So he goes out to meet Attila the Hun and convinces Attila to turn back. And there's a number of reasons for that. But I want to say part of what I want to do is for you to see the abilities of Leo. How does Leo get Attila to turn back? And there's a few reasons for this. If you read late renditions, there's a superstitious fear by Attila the Hun. Alaric, who sacked Rome in 410, died just a year or two later, and so there's the divine retribution if you sack Rome. Don't do that, which is a possible reason not to sack a city.
Actually spent his formative years in Rome. His uncle was concerned he was going to take over and sent him to Rome to soften him up. But what he did is he saw how soft the Romans were.
So
And that's why when he started going east, he met resistance. He did not know what the strength was, but he knew what it was like west, and that's why he changed his mind and went west.
yeah, so he bounces around a couple times, going back and forth and things like that. But when he comes into Rome, Leo, what you need to see from Leo is that he's an intelligent political actor. He sees what's going on with Attila's army. In Italy had been having famine for 2 years. So there's no food. Part of what you do as an invading army is you take all the crops, you take all the food, and you use that to supply your troops. It's really hard in the 400s to supply a long-distance army, so you can't do that. So Leo knows this. There's no food in the area for you. Rome and the surrounding areas are very prone to malaria and other diseases. It's just starting to affect Attila's army. The diseases are just starting to affect Attila's army there. They had a difficult time crossing the Alps. He knows these different things. So Leo is able to come and present sort of a wealth of arguments, and he's able to offer tribute. He's like, here's all this money, take this money and leave. So he's able to do these things and tell him, like, look, Attila, you're sure to win, right? You're sure to come in and overwhelm us and destroy the city. But at what cost? You're going to lose your army doing this. We're willing to offer you X tribute. The sickness is going to set in and these different things. And he's able to basically have a negotiation with Attila, sort of win him over and pay him tribute and send him off. It was the donuts that sealed the deal. And so he's able to sort of to be politically astute and to be careful and to make negotiations happen. And so that's part of what he's good at. He's also a theologian. He writes the Tome of Leo. Much of our language about the hypostatic union comes from Leo. So even today, how we talk about the natures of Christ, the two natures of Christ being united in one person, a lot of that comes from Leo the Great. On the darker side for us, as Protestants, he's one of the first to promote papal primacy based on the succession of Peter. So he's one of the first people to put forward that argument. There was in 455, a new threat came to Rome. Genseric came to invade Rome. He did sack the city, but Leo was able to persuade him to leave all the churches alone and then have, I think it was 3 days head notice, basically to pack as many people into the churches as he could to keep them safe. And so he's able to mitigate that disaster to some degree as well. So Pope Leo the great for a number of reasons. One is the just political abilities to preserve the city of Rome, and the other is the theological capabilities of speaking about the nature of Christ. All right. We're going to fast forward. I think I said, what year did I say before? Did I say 800 for Gregory? Gregory the Great rules from 590 to 604. Second pope to be called the Great. I think I already said John Calvin called him the last good pope. He comes out of a monastery. So you see him here, sainted. He's got the halo. He comes out of a monastery to serve. He regrets leaving his monastery. So one author has called him a saint from a family of saints. And by all accounts, he's sort of an all-around good guy. He's a person you would like to know. He does duty in Constantinople for a time. But really, can anybody read that? Non Angli said Angeli, si Christiani. Gregory is really the first great missionary pope. What he does is he sends missionaries out. To England. So what we have, so the Romans are dark-haired people. So here we see in this picture, there's these youths. So he's here in a slave market in Rome, and here are these white, fair-haired children. And he sees them, he says, who are those? And somebody says they're Angli, they're Anglos, Anglo-Saxons. They're from Britain, they're Anglos. And he says, not Anglos, but angels if they were Christians. And we need to send missionaries to these people that are pagan. They're from the city of Deira, and he says, we need to go save them Deira, which means from wrath, from anger. We need to send missionaries so that they'll be saved from wrath, from anger. So he's a fan of puns. But he sends Augustine of Canterbury, so not Augustine of Hippo, but Augustine of Canterbury, sends him to Canterbury, sends him to England, and it's during that time that the church is established in England, and lots of missionaries are sent out to the Germanic tribes. One of the things that this signifies is the shift away from the Roman Empire. We're no longer concerned. We're less concerned about the West and getting aid from the emperor who's in Constantinople, and we're now focused on Germanic tribes and French tribes and things like that. Reforms Christian worship. If you've heard of Gregorian chants, it comes from him. Gregorian calendar is not him. It's a later Gregory. Reforms papal bureaucracy. His big question, if he goes into a city to check up on the bishops and says, who are the poor here, where do they live? And if they don't know, basically he gets rid of them and gets in somebody who will take care of the poor and things like that. So he's very, very interested in helping the poor using the church's resources. But as time goes on, the papacy gains in power, partly under Gregory's reforms. He's sort of an accountant before the principles of accounting are established. He really makes things run smoothly, which is going to bring in power and wealth. All right. So, questions so far? What we're going to do, so we're not going to go too much longer. I got a few more popes that I just kind of want to hit and give a sense of time and place to some of these people. I'll give some hooks to kind of hang our hat on. But that's sort of the story of the papacy that I wanted to give. Moving forward, we're going to continue to see more politics. We're going to continue to see more nepotism, things like that. We'll see attempts at reform and all sorts of things. But really, we're going to see the way starting to be paved from a papal point of view for the Reformation and need for reform and things like that. So now what we're going to see with Stephen is a raising of papal power. So Pope Stephen II, 752 to 757, Pepin is a king in France. So in France, there had been this rule of kings called the Merovingians, also called the do-nothing kings. So these Merovingians, these do-nothing kings, sat in their palace, and they let the mayor of the palace run everything. Eventually, Pepin says to the Pope, he's like, hey, is it the person king who was born king, or is the person king who does all the work of the king? And Stephen, being a smart guy, realizing who has all the power, says, it's the person who does all the work, of course, i.e. you, Pepin. And so he anoints Pepin as king, allows them to get rid of the do-nothing kings, and now Pepin becomes king of the Franks. And
Was it his father Charlemagne though?
no, son. Pepin's the father. Pepin the Short is the father of Charlemagne. Yes, I've lost my train of thought. I know you're fine. But one of the things this signifies is he looks to Pepin because he needs protection. He needs help. There's these Lombards and others that are coming into Italy and causing problems and taking over papal lands and so on. So he needs help. So he says, hey, Pepin, I just anointed you king. Shouldn't you come down and help me out? And Pepin says, I would love to. And so Pepin comes down, beats up the bad guys, gives it to the Pope. We have the donation of Pepin now, who gives all the land, the basically central 2/3 of Italy to the Pope. And now the Pope is no longer looking west to the emperor to help them. He's looking north to the Franks to help them. And soon that Franks are going to be emperors in their own right, because now we see something that hasn't ever happened before. We see a Pope crowning someone as emperor, much to the chagrin of the emperor in the east, who's like, hey, I'm still Pope, or I'm still emperor, but they're so busy over there, they can't come and force their will in the west. They're basically totally divorced. So Leo III crowns Charlemagne king in 800 on Christmas Day. And Charlemagne is there in the church, and he's like, oh my goodness, I had no idea this was happening. Wow, I wouldn't have come to church today if I had known this. And everyone in the choir, of course, everyone in the church knows, and they start singing and whatnot. And so Charlemagne is crowned as emperor. And this idea of the Pope having the ability to crown the emperor is a big deal. Later on, popes will say, I can crown you and I can decrown you. I can depose you. And so we have popes deposing emperors. And this is going to last for a long time. Napoleon is going to be sort of crowned by a pope. He's going to bring the pope up, and Napoleon is going to take the crown and put it on his own head, but he's going to have the pope there presiding over it. So this lasts a long time, into the mid-1800s.
Napoleon's not Christian.
No, but Napoleon is pragmatic. Napoleon said, if I lived over the Jews, I would rebuild Solomon's temple. So that was sort of his idea towards religion. I would reign over Christians, so I'll protect the Pope. So Leo IX, so we're skipping forward to 1049, Great Schism with the East. So in 1054, the East and the West anathematizes each other. This kind of thing had been going on patriarchs have been anathematized by the popes. Popes have been anathematized by the patriarch in Constantinople. This kind of thing had happened. This is sort of the last time it happens. It doesn't really get healed until the 1960s, like our century, 1960s. And it's still kind of not healed. But really, this isn't... If we don't have the Fourth Crusade, which we're going to talk about Crusades next week, if we don't have the Fourth Crusade, this probably gets brushed over. The Fourth Crusade is really what kills relations with the East and West. But at this point, they're on different trajectories. They're on different trajectories anyway. It's been too hard. There's been too much break between them. Let's keep going. Gregory the Seventh. So in the 10th century, that's the 900s, we had the dark century for the popes, where basically no one outside of Italy cares about the Pope. The Pope is not talked about, not known. The Abbot of Cluny is way more powerful, way more important than the Pope. The Pope is basically just one more ruler in a city in Italy where everybody's squabbling and fighting all the time. Lots of debauchery and lots of just sort of terrible activity in that time. Pope Gregory comes around, Gregory the Seventh comes around 1073, and we start getting the Gregorian reforms. So he gives us the Gregorian calendar. Before that, we had the Julian calendar from Julius Caesar. Problem with the Julian calendar is it doesn't account for leap years, and so we get every 4 years we get off a day, which isn't really a big deal, except when you're talking about 1,000 years. You're 1,000 days off now. So it's getting off, and then so he reforms it. There's 10 days in October that he just deletes, since those days no longer exist. And anyway, we start moving in this direction. He is the one who clashes with Henry IV, and we have Canossa. What happens at Canossa? Anybody know? Henry at Canossa. Bismarck in the 1800s says, "I will not go to Canossa." No? Okay. So, all right. So Henry IV. He is the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So Charlemagne is his great-great-great-grandfather or something like that. You know, he's the one that's anointed by... I take that back. He's not great-great-great-grandfather, because the problem with the Holy Roman Emperor is that they're elected. Okay, so it's an elected power, which is...
The Germans, right?
Yeah, in the Germans, right? So we can think of it we can think of it as modern Germany. The leader of the Holy Roman Empire is elected among the barons, which we think of elections as great. It's better. It's bad. You want a hereditary monarchy. Hereditary monarchy is going to have more power, more structure. The passing of the guard is better. There's a lot of reasons that make a hereditary monarchy more powerful than that make your country more stable long term than an elected monarchy. It's just not a good idea for all sorts of reasons that I'm not going to talk about. So Henry has this political problem where he has to keep his barons happy with him. But he's also emperor, and he's also powerful and strong. And so he and Pope Gregory, they fight. Henry deposes Gregory as pope, which have happened before. Emperors have deposed popes and said we need a new one, that's happened. That's got historical precedence. But Gregory deposes Henry, which has never happened before. So the Pope is now deposing an emperor, saying you can't be emperor. So he deposes him, he excommunicates him, which, if Gregory wasn't elected and didn't have these other barons who were sort of scheming against him, he could say, forget it, I'll just march on Rome, get rid of this Pope, and get a new Pope. But he can't do that because politics. So Gregory is going out to meet with these other barons to help elect a new Pope. Henry meets him halfway, and instead of fighting, Henry does something surprising. He does penance in the snow before the castle in Canossa. He does penance in the snow for 3 days so that Gregory has to forgive him and allow him back into the church. This is a politically brilliant move. It does everything he needs to do. The barons that were against him are met together. They're waiting for the Pope. The Pope never arrives. Henry's able to come and put them down. But it's a PR problem that Henry never recovers from, because he is the emperor who did penance barefoot in the snow at Canossa, to the point where Bismarck, the 19th century German sort of great man who really establishes Germany. He says, I will not go to Canossa. So it becomes a famous thing. So he is, and we start, Gregory becomes a very internationally powerful pope. So 75 years later, no one cares about the popes. By the time of Gregory, he's able to sort of establish the monarchy so strongly, not the monarchy, the papacy so strongly that he's able to make an emperor do penance in the snow. And he really is set about reforming it. So trying to get rid of nepotism, trying to get rid of lay investiture. Lay investiture is where kings and emperors would appoint bishops. And they say, no. Bishops should be appointed by the church. We're not looking for someone under your pay. We're looking at someone who will be holy and do what's right and lead their church. We don't want the mayor appointing the pastors in the town. That's not what we want. So get rid of lay investiture. Get rid of simony, which is, so Simon Magus, he tries to buy the Holy Spirit. Get rid of simony, where people buy their bishoprics. So I want to be pastor of that church. It's got a lot of land it's in control of. It brings in a lot of money. I'll pay you $1 million so that I can have this place that's got $1 million a year revenue, or whatever. So get rid of simony, those kinds of things. So he is working hard to reform those. Urban II is another reforming pope. He's going to launch the Crusades. More about him next time. Pope Innocent III. It's a flattering mosaic. Yeah, probably the most powerful pope of all time. Definitely the most powerful man in Europe during his lifetime. Definitely most powerful man in Europe. So this is 1198 to 1216. So just as a symbol of how strong he is, John gives all of England to him. King John, like Robin Hood, King John. John the Only, right? He's John the Only because he was such a bad king that no monarchs are allowed to name their children John, just in case that person becomes king. So he's John the Only. And yeah, so he has to basically make all of England be a papal state, and they send off annual tribute to the Pope. He organizes crusades, he reforms the clergy, he gives interdicts, basically saying an entire country is excommunicated until the king does what I want, all sorts of things. He annuls the Magna Carta. He says Magna Carta, do we know what that is? Yep. Okay, Magna Carta, no, that's not a thing. He founds the Franciscans when St. Francis of Assisi comes to him. Anyway, Pope Innocent. Yeah. All right, but that, within a short time, we're going to have the Babylonian captivity. So the Babylonian captivity, this has nothing to do with Babylon. This is when the popes move to Avignon, France. So normally they're in Rome, and they move to Avignon, France. Basically, the first pope sort of gets kidnapped and taken there, and then the other popes are by the French king. The French king wants the popes to do what he wants. He can keep a better eye on them if they're in France. So he kidnaps one, brings him to France, sets him up there, and then for a period of 75 years, give or take, the popes are there in France. And this is their humble abode. So it's nice. But the papacy does a lot of, the papal library gets established here. It becomes a very wealthy, nice place to live. Eventually the popes realize, okay, Bishop of Rome is my title. I've got to get back to Rome. So we head back to Rome in 1377. What was that? Yes, we get the year of the three popes. So Western Schism, so that's where we're at right now. So this happens sort of during the Avignon period, at the end of the Avignon period. So 378 to 1417. We get two rival popes who come up. So we get anti-pope. This is now anti-pope galore season. So we've had anti-popes throughout the history pop up here and there in issues. Like if you go on the Wikipedia page and look at the list of popes, I mean, they've got like a dark gray. I don't think you can go a full page without seeing an anti-pope at some point. But this period, you get like a whole block of gray anti-popes. First, we have two rivals to it. And then we have a council come along and say, those two popes, we're just going to wipe the slate with them. We'll get a third pope. But now the problem is we have three popes instead of one pope. So we get all these different claimants to the throne. And this doesn't get resolved until 1417, which is 100 years before Martin Luther. And the view of the papacy is dim, right? We got 3 different popes. We got anger at the things that are going on. The Council of Constance comes up. The Council of Constance will condemn John Huss, sort of a pre-Reformation movement. But the Council of Constance comes up in 1415 to 18. 1417 is sort of when this is established. And they basically go to 2 of the popes and say, will you please resign? Please resign. And they say, yes, we'll resign. So they they get 2 out of the 3 to resign. The third one is sort of the worst of them. And he's like, I will not resign. No way. The other 2 popes resigned. I'm the pope. Like, this done deal, guys. But he won't resign. But thankfully, he dies. Thankfully, I don't know if that's the right way to say that. He dies. So thankfully for them, he dies. And they're able to appoint a new pope. And so now in 1417, we get the appointment of one pope who is sort of a reforming pope. He returns to Rome. And basically from this point forward, we won't really have popes being driven out of Rome or leaving Rome to live. And so they'll stay in Rome for long times. It'll be more peaceful rules, less tragic. We'll get the Renaissance popes, which are not known for their morality, but they are known for the arts, and we're going to get lots of good art from that period. But this really sets the stage for Reformation. There's a phrase that comes out of the Council of Constance, and the phrase for the Council of Constance is general reform of the Church of God in head and in members. And the head referring to the Pope, and members referring to the rest of the clergy. And so there's this atmosphere of reform. From about 1350 to really the Reformation, there is just constant clamor for reform in the church. We need reform, we need reform. We have Wycliffe in 1312-ish. We have John Huss here. He's guaranteed safe counsel to the Council of Constance. He's condemned there, he's killed, which 100 years later, Martin Luther will be guaranteed safe conscience to the Diet of Worms. And this question is, what about Huss? But we've got this Reformation fervor that's in the air to a large degree because of the failure of the papacy. And some of the questions that we have about the papacy and those issues are really part of what drives Reformation. It's just the papacy can be held up as something that is just so corrupt throughout. It's just so corrupt. Yes, there's shining lights. Yes, there's Leo the Great. Yes, there's Gregory the Great. Yes, there's good guys here and there. But it's just so corrupt throughout that can be pointed to.
Is the way you get your pope different now than it was then? 'Cause I don't think,
Yeah.
if you got a system like now, how did you end up with 3 popes at one time back then?
That's a great question.
I thought it was like all the bishops or archbishops or whatever
Yeah.
got together.
Who watched the video I sent today? Okay, so that video I sent today is how you become pope today. So the College of Cardinals appoints the pope. So they pick a pope, and generally they pick a cardinal. So there's a College of Cardinals that says, you're it, and they pick somebody. That gets established, but I think it's Gregory. I could be wrong. I think it's the Gregory we talked about. Not Gregory the Great Reformed Gregory. Basically establishes that. The problem is you get corrupt cardinals. And so now you get some people, and you get different groups of cardinals that are swayed by different people. So this lay investiture is a problem. So if you're if you're the French king, you want to choose bishops and you want to choose cardinals, and the popes, there's political back and forth, and so the pope might make a concession. You get to choose, you French king, you get to choose 2 French cardinals. And now when the pope dies, and now we've got everybody coming together, these cardinals, some of which live in France, some of which live in Italy and whatnot, the French cardinals get together, they elect a pope. The Italian cardinals get together, they elect a pope. Both of them say the other appointment is wrong, so on and so forth. There's a lot of irregularity in how popes are actually elected.
Just like the House of Representatives.
I guess so. Yeah, so, yeah. And the mob is always important in Rome. There's lots of popes that have to flee and come back and so on.
Well, I'm clear, what was the procedure before all of this?
So it's it
Did all of these
in-
people come together to elect
so in theory.
the third or whatever? I don't-
In theory, what it was the bishops of the area elect the next pope. He's presented before the people and affirmed by the people. If the people don't want him, he can't be pope. If the bishops don't appoint him, he can't be pope. That gets them formalized sort of into this cardinal situation.
What do you mean by area?
What?
What do you mean by area?
That's a.
It's not-
I mean, I'm intentionally
it's not
vague.
the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, and it's worldwide.
Eventually. I mean, it's a long period.
Pope of what?
It's a long period. So if you're
Everybody is too.
Catholics.
Well, not in the East.
So if you're in the 900 range, basically it's the people in Rome and Florence in that area. If you're pope in the 1200s, there's a lot. Well, the cardinals are established, and the cardinals are basically bishops from all over that are sort of sent to Rome. So it varies and it changes. Like, to answer that question, you got to say, when are you talking about? And even that when is going to be like highly particular to each pope.
So there's nothing biblical in that.
No. No. I would say the early.
Well, I mean, they try to.
So yeah. So the earliest way it was done, so I think pre-300 basically, was an attempt at something. We take the presbyters, the elders, they appoint someone, they bring him before the congregation and say, this is the next pastor, approve it or not. And that's sort of loosely based on Acts 15, where basically James is sort of leader. There's discussion among them. It seems good to the church, and then they send this letter. So that's sort of where it originally comes from, and then it just takes off from there. It's bought and sold and so on.
So how did they claim that the mantle of Peter then is passed down when Peter has nothing to do with any of this?
Peter's the bishop of Rome, and they're just his representative.
Somebody, Elijah Jr. didn't have to chase him around and wait till he was going to kick the bucket and grab it, get his spirit. You know, I mean, it's like, what do you mean he passed it down? It doesn't sound like Peter, or maybe if Peter actually did pass it down to one guy, it doesn't sound like that tradition lasted very long.
Right. I mean, it's.
The church doesn't claim Peter as the first bishop of Rome, does it? Their claim is that he's the rock.
Their claim is that, well, both. They would say he's not the first bishop of Rome, but they would say he's the first pope of Rome, because the church existed in Rome before Peter was there. Demonstrably in the New Testament, it existed before Peter was there, and so there were presbyters there, but the first pope of Rome, kind of pope of Rome, was Peter. Peter's an apostle, so so it's like a super category. Like, he's above the pope, so he's not included in the lists because he's an apostle, not a pope. But to be a pope would be a step down. So, yeah.
Just in our lifetime, Pope John the 23rd, he deliberately took that name John because that, like you were saying, it had been banned.
Well, that's for kings of England. That's not the pope.
I
But-
thought he took that name John for the purpose of other popes being able to use that name.
Well, John 23rd.
Yes. So Pope John the 20th. So part of the problem with popes and anti-popes and stuff is, who is actually a pope? If you got two competing guys, what if one of them, like, retrospectively was a good guy and the other one was not a good guy? Like, you could, I mean, as modern pope, you can say, well, this guy was pope and we're going to ignore this guy, right? And that's kind of what happens with John the 23rd. He takes the title John the 23rd, even though there had been basically two John the 22nds. So I forget what the exact details were. If he had chosen the 24th, it would have meant one thing for one pope. And if he chose the 23rd, it would have been that guy wasn't a pope, and he takes the name the 23rd. So interesting. There was, who is it? Pope Paul. John Paul. This is the tidbit that doesn't matter at all. John Paul the First was the first pope to take the first as part of the name. Because normally you don't get the first until there's a second, right? Like, yeah, that works. He took the name John Paul the First, John Paul the First. And he did die within a year, and then the next pope was John Paul II. So it worked out for him. But it's just kind of a funny thing. I don't know. That has nothing to do with this. It's just kind of... So this... History's complicated. Politics are complicated. Papal politics are especially complicated.
Really not surprising since we're all broken humans.
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't surprise us because we're all broken humans. So anyway, the two things I hope you got out of this was, number one, the evolution of this. This doesn't just pop out of nowhere. This develops over time and with lots of reasons. I'll give you three things, I guess. Two, the Catholic Church itself recognizes the undesirable quality of some of their popes. And number three, this really is a keystone for the Reformation. This really is going to lead, the failure of the papacy really is going to lead to the Reformation. I forget which pope it was, but one of the popes was called by his biographer, like, he would have been a great pope if he cared for religion at all. So we'll end on that note. But this is setting the stage for the Reformation and the recovery of a biblical church government and many other things, but at least in that. Let's end. Lord, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for some of the humor of some of these popes. Lord, we thank you for just the good popes, if we can call them that, those who led faithfully, who cared for people, who protected the poor, who helped preserve life, who preached your word, who followed you wholly. And Lord, for those that were wicked, that turned from you, we thank you that it did lead to the Reformation and recovery of things like your word and sola scriptura. So Lord, let us live in light of these truths. Let us be ones who follow your word wholeheartedly. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Oh, I just
All right.
opened up. There's several Pippins, so I'm thinking of the son of.
Okay.
You were talking about the other one, and I didn't know the other one.